In the show Big Mouth, the hormone monsters that we see embodying the emotions of the kids work in an office and are thus personified down into a distinctly modern and human context. The Good Place also does something similar. Death and Taxes is this novelty but for video games. It recontextualizes the role of the Grim Reaper as a desk jockey that reaps by way of sifting through paperwork. So imagine Death with a marker pen tapping his fingers or flipping a coin to decide who lives and dies in order to meet his daily quota is a palpable satirical image. It grounds those elusive ideas of the abstract and unknown forces of life that go outside of our understanding as a way to play with them. It also gives enough distance to allow the premise itself to function as commentary. The fact such morally and ethically challenging decisions, who is to live and die, are partaken within a bureaucratic context serves as a light critique of the role and its function within our own society. How is it fair to make these decisions when all you have to go on is a paragraph summarising the basics of a person and a couple guidelines from your boss? It's a setup that encourages you to test whether lines are truly drawn and experiment, which is what I actually did not try to do on my first playthrough. I followed instructions and was essentially the ideal worker, doing what I was told. It's hard at first because before you can really start to assume this role, the implications of life or death decisions are quite difficult to approach, no matter how much you're told it's just what has to be done. Even if all you get is a paragraph and a picture, you still feel the weight of marking someone's doomed fate, at least to begin with. It takes a big step back from who you are as the one sitting at your computer to force yourself to not invest into what you're doing. In fact, it wasn't until after the first employee review that I felt I could just shrug my shoulders at the choices. That's the compelling point the game starts on, asking you to make such tough calls. I'm just not sure that it moves forward from this core concept enough to continue exploring more potentials, because despite my original hesitations about how I made my choices and marked those papers, I was soon able to blaze through and adhere to the instructions without any thought to how unfair they might have seemed. That's when I was surprised by a couple of spanners that were thrown into the works. On one early round within one of the profiles, your boss, Fate, directly tells you how to mark the paper, which hinted that the game might be beginning to test your eye for details to prevent a player from blindingly marking profiles without proper consideration. Alas, it never really takes that idea forward. Then one round saw a paper encouraging me to rebel. I chose not to and followed the initial instructions from Fate. Long story short, Fate's instructions destroy the world, and throughout the game you get questioned about your obedience and told you're boring until Fate confirms he actually dislikes humans and was setting you up to end their existence the whole time, which metaphorically seems to act as a critique of following any process blindly and detaching your conscience from your own judgment and agency. Fair enough, it works, but it wasn't the first time I felt the game was saying something obvious. All the more so that I had consciously chosen to follow the instructions without my own personal interference in order to roleplay. Therefore, the ending felt shallow, especially since the encouragement to break the rules only came up once, and the idea of the game being detail orientated also doesn't rear its head up directly again. In Papers, Please, there's enough specific criteria changing each day, more information to consider, and time pressure to actually make the pointing and clicking feel engaging. Death and Taxes doesn't spin the way you have to approach your choices in any meaningful way. It remains binary. 3 people have to die, people with a science background have to die, anyone over 40 has to live, etc, etc. The problem is that these instructions don't change how you interact with the game. It's just keeping an eye out for basic details, and the only reason you'd purposely go against these instructions is just for your own sake or to game it for a certain ending, which feels disingenuous because it robs the process of marking people for life or death of its weight, which is at odds with what made it initially compelling. Yet that could be purposeful, for there's just enough to infer that reducing the task to being something quite boring was actually intentional. The repetitive music gets you into that daily grind mindset. The image of Grim in the lift every day evokes that sense he's just a drone, going to work, going to bed, going to work, going to bed. As mentioned, the critique here serves to show how making such philosophical and ethically taxing decisions within a bureaucratic context adds unhealthy distance to the proceedings, especially since the best endings achieved by not following Fate's instruction and paying attention to the people and their lives, making choices within your own moral compass, or at least within a morality the game considers just. but also with an acceptance that what you're doing sucks, because sometimes those who may not deserve it have to die in order to maintain the balance of the world. However, I feel like the game stumbles over itself with all of this because of the way it communicates the results of your choices to you. A phone sits on your desk hosting a faux Twitter/newsfeed analog that reports on the events of the Earth as you make your choices. You can play off it, and generally it's a decent way to convey that what you're doing affects the development of the world. The problem is that the game never effectively communicates that this is where the true plot resides. What's more immediate to you is the dialogue segments with fate, and of course the wraparound context of a supernatural bureaucracy. You quite literally spend no time outside of the office, therefore you'd be forgiven for thinking the game was about the place it spends the most time, with you as Grim and your interactions with fate, and deconstructing the world it's built and put right in front of you. If you were to make that assumption, you'd be hit with a sudden revelation that the Earth's all of a sudden in ruins, since what the game really cares about is the secret score it keeps hidden under the surface, rather than the dialogue or mechanics you're presently engaging with. To be clear, the problem is not the choice to have such a system, but how poorly it is communicated and presented to the player. I found out that there were hidden statistics because of a random achievement saying that I increased them, rather than the game itself making it clear. While the phone reports on events, it's uncertain if it's just a novelty rather than anything of substance, since the game is littered with acknowledged but inconsequential responses to your actions. You could just put the phone in your drawer and forget about it until your own dialogue options opts to mention that the world has gone to hell, presenting a disconnect between what Grim is aware of and the player. I could bring this back to the idea of a meta commentary on the distance of the bureaucratic process creating disaster itself is blind to, but I think that I'd be giving the game too much credit at this point, since it's the presentational flaws that I derived this from. It doesn't strike me as something intentional, making the player not even aware of what should be important to them. Considering that there's a numbers game underneath all this, it again deflates the interesting thematic potential for the game to be about your own moral decision making, and instead boils down to a flat set of boxes to be ticked in order to unlock a slideshow, which runs the steam out of every mechanical interaction of the game. If meta commentary on bureaucracy is indeed intended, it's what I meant when I said the game was disingenuous for it to then reveal itself to just be a multiple endings chase. The critique the game brings upon a player for blindingly following fate's instructions holds no weight now that it breaks its own illusion. Your choices having an interesting sense of meaning is gone. The people written about on the papers that arrive on your desk are now literally reduced to mathematical equations. They can all be marked with little consideration, with only the end goal in mind. And that's how the game fails to sustain itself. The fundamental mechanic, the moment to moment of marking life or death, what you do most, isn't even satisfying on its own now that the whole thing has fallen flat. Given that there's such a presentational emphasis on the office itself, it's a shame that it's not so fun to interact with. Quite literally, pointing and clicking in Death and Taxes doesn't feel that tactile. I like the desk and how it gets crowded with paper and items. I think many of us have been there if you've ever tried organising so much with a limited workspace. But there's just not quite enough options to rotate or align the paper or trinkets, not to mention the lack of tactility with these objects. It feels like you're just dragging and dropping JPEGs pasted over another flat image of the desk itself, and it not only feels weightless but looks amateurish. Not to mention the art in general, whilst charming and detailed, just seems to be missing something. I can't quite help but feel the context hasn't been fully realised here, even in the small ways such as the registration for the literal tick box feeling off. Although I've been highly critical, there's a lot of details the game does account for. Despite the presentational missteps, the way the writing incorporates your choices into the smaller moments is the game at its best. As an example, there are the opportunities for people to pop up who believe in the world simulation theory, and it seems that if you spare them, the idea gets spread around to many more people and the belief grows. It's the better example of storytelling the game nails because it's baked within where you spend the most time, i.e. reading profiles at your desk. I already critiqued how the game doesn't explain its devices very well, but that doesn't mean the writing itself is bad. In fact, it strikes a nice balance between the cerebral and the humorous, with a variety of details that are well considered as part of the player's options, such as implying the stuffed gerbil plushie is possibly sentient to some degree after you give it to the cat to tear apart. The shopkeeper is a likeable dunce too, having contextualized everything you can buy from him through the lens of a pirate myth and stories, often ending in some wonderfully deadpan one-liners. Fate is also well acted, and despite the options not meaning much in the grand scheme of things, they are there and mould the edges of the game to the point where I can imagine everyone could have at least one unique playthrough to themselves. The option for a New Game Plus adds some extra subtleties too, and even breaks the fourth wall as your new Grim is aware of what fate has secretly planned out based on the previous playthrough. It's a nice way to handle the idea of having another go at doing things right, but housing so within the narrative itself. Neat touches is what the game does best, and I couldn't damn the entire thing because clearly a lot of care went into thinking about the ways the game can acknowledge the player's inputs. It's just when it comes down to the actual game experience of Death and Taxes, it falls short of not only capitalizing on its concept but also making itself clear as to what the game actually is. Right now it falls between an adventure game and an interactive novel, and it can't quite seem to dedicate itself to creating a cohesive experience within either category. It leaves the game deflated, and the idea of making multiple runs to achieve the many endings is one of little attraction when there's not at least one element to really see you through the repetitive structure of the game. If I've learned anything from Death and Taxes, it's that the amount of choice a game has doesn't really matter, even if they've got a consequence for everyone. What matters is if you, as the player, care about making those choices, because if not, well, what's keeping you here?